Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, me too. Today we are attempting something pretty ambitious. We are looking at a stack of material that is, well, honestly, it's a bit intimidating at first glance.
Oh, for sure.
We're doing a deep dive into Ray Dalio's principles for dealing with the changing world order. But I want to set the table right away for you listening. This is not a book review.
No, absolutely not. That would be a disservice to the material.
Right. We aren't here to critique the prose or talk about Dalio's hedge fund career or Bridgewater's management culture or any of the personality-driven narratives that usually surround this stuff.
We're treating this text as an autopsy.
An autopsy of history. I like that framing.
Yeah. We are basically dissecting the body of the global system to see how it lived, how it thrived, and, ultimately how it dies.
Dalio calls it the perpetual motion machine. The core premise here is that if you look at the last 500 years, so you've got the Dutch Empire, the British Empire, the American Empire, and even going further back into the Chinese dynasties, you see the exact same script playing out over and over again.
It is almost eerie how repetitive the pattern is.
It really is. And the stakes of this analysis for you as the listener are incredibly high. The argument isn't just that history repeats itself in some vague or poetic sense.
Right. The claim is that the world is undergoing a massive structural shift right now, a shift that has not happened in our lifetimes.
But it has happened repeatedly throughout history.
Exactly. Specifically, the source material points to the period between 1930 and 1945 as the last time we saw this specific configuration of macro forces.
So we're talking about a massive historical pivot. And the reason we use the title Crisis in Perception for this project is that most of us navigate the world assuming the future will just be a slightly modified version of the present.
We suffer from an extreme normalcy bias.
We assume stability because stability is all we have ever known.
But the source material suggests something radically different. It suggests that identity is actually system. Empires function exactly like biological organisms.
They have a birth, a growth phase, a peak, and a decline.
Right. And these phases aren't random. They're driven by highly logical cause and effect relationships. Biology is actually the perfect metaphor here.
How so?
Well, you don't get surprised when a human being ages. You don't get shocked when a teenager has a sudden growth spurt or when an 80-year-old becomes frail.
Because it's programmed in.
Exactly. It's programmed into the biology. Dalio is arguing that empires have a similar genetic code. A nation isn't just a random collection of people and borders. It's a life cycle.
So our mission today is to tear apart this machine. We are going to look at the design of the rise, the incentives that shape the peak, the actual mechanics of the decline, and then finally how all this interconnects today.
We need to understand the gears so we don't get crushed by them.
Well said. Let's start with the architecture of the rise, the bell curve of empire.
Yeah, Dalio visualizes the life of an empire as a classic bell curve. You have the ascent, the top, and the descent.
But what actually causes the rise? Because it obviously doesn't just happen by accident.
No, it doesn't. It starts with what he calls the new order, which usually comes out of a conflict.
Right, a civil war or an external war that wipes the slate clean.
Think about the American Civil War or World War II. You have a massive conflict that destroys the old way of doing things. It establishes a completely new power structure.
The winners consolidate power.
They do. And if they do it effectively, and that is that consolidation of power leads to peace.
And peace is the soil for prosperity.
Precisely. You cannot build a complex economy in the middle of a civil war. You can't invest in a 10-year supply chain if you don't know if your factory is going to be bombed tomorrow.
You need absolute stability.
But stability alone doesn't make you an empire.
Right. I mean, Switzerland is incredibly stable, but it's not the dominant global hegemon. So there is a difference between being a healthy country and being the empire.
Huge difference.
So what is the ignition switch? What turns a peaceful country into a dominant world power?
According to the data in the source material, it is almost always education.
Education. I have to say it sounds almost too wholesome. Like we're reading a brochure for a liberal arts college.
I know, it really does sound like a platitude.
Yeah.
But if you look at the mechanics of the cycle, it is the ultimate leading indicator.
Walk us through that.
Before an empire becomes a military superpower or a financial superpower, it becomes an educational superpower. Education creates a broad-based meritocratic workforce.
And that shifts the entire culture.
Yes, it shifts it heavily towards innovation and technology. Let's look at the rise of the Dutch in the 1600s. They had the absolute highest literacy rates in the world at the time.
And what did that lead to?
They were inventing everything.
Yeah.
Lenses, microscopes, new ways of processing herring.
And if you look at the U.S. in the 20th century, it's the same thing. We had the best university system in the world and programs like the GI Bill that brought massive amounts of the population into higher education.
So you have smart people, but it's not just smart in some abstract philosophical sense. It is highly applied intelligence.
Right. You have educated people who invent new technologies. And that leads directly to the second determinant in the cycle.
Productivity and competitiveness.
Because you are better educated and have better techno, you produce things far more efficiently than your rivals.
You basically become the workshop of the world.
So going back to the Dutch example.
Right. The Dutch invented these ships, the fluid ship, that could carry way more cargo with fewer crew members than the English or Spanish ship.
Which is a pure technology advantage.
Derived entirely from education and engineering. And what it meant in practical terms was that they could ship goods cheaper than anyone else on Earth.
And later on, the British mastered the steam engine.
And the Americans mastered mass production and eventually the internet. It is the exact same beat every single time.
Innovation leads to productivity. And if you are making the best stuff at the best price, you get the biggest share of world trade.
You start dominating global commerce.
Now, this triggers the next necessary step in the system. Because if you have your ships sailing all over the world carrying your incredibly valuable goods...
Spices from the East Indies, or textiles from Manchester, or iPhones from California.
Right. What do you need? You need to protect them. You absolutely need a military.
Precisely. And this is where the causality is so important to understand. You don't build a massive military just for fun.
Or just because the nation is naturally aggressive.
Exactly. The military necessity grows organically out of the economic success. You build a massive navy because you have to protect the trade routes that your economy now relies on.
So now you have economic dominance and military dominance working together.
And this is where the money really comes in, the financial center.
Because everyone is trading with you.
Yes, everyone trades with you. And because you are the safest place in the world to do business, thanks to that military and the legal stability, global capital naturally flows into your cities.
Amsterdam became the center of the world, then London, then New York.
I want to pause on this because the term financial center sounds a bit abstract.
Yeah, let's break that down. We are basically saying that the world's savings account moves to your neighborhood.
That is a fantastic way to put it. Think about it. If you were a wealthy merchant in 1650 day, you didn't want to keep your gold in Paris or Madrid, where the local king might just arbitrarily seize it to fund a war.
You kept it in Amsterdam.
Because it was safe. Later, you kept it in London. Today, all that global savings flows straight into Wall Street.
And this leads directly to the crown jewel of the rise, the ultimate weapon of the empire.
Reserve currency status.
I feel like this is a term you hear on the financial news constantly. You know, people saying the dollar's the reserve currency, but we rarely stop to unpack what it actually means for the deep architecture of an empire.
It is the ultimate leverage in the global system.
Why is it the crown jewel?
Because everyone trades in your currency. And because central banks all around the world want to save in your currency because it is safe and highly liquid, you get what's called an exorbitant privilege.
Exorbitant privilege. That's a French phrase originally, isn't it? Coined by a French finance minister who was pretty angry at the Americans.
Yes, it was Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in the 1960s. And honestly, he was right to be angry from his perspective.
Because what it means structurally is that the empire can borrow money much more cheaply than anyone else.
The rest of the world is essentially lending you money at rock-bottom interest rates because they physically need your currency just to function in the global market.
Let's break that mechanic down so it's super clear. If I am a normal country, say Brazil or Thailand, and I want to buy oil on the global market, I have to earn dollars first to buy it.
Correct. You have to actually produce value. You make stuff, you sell it to the world, you get dollars in exchange, and then you take those dollars to buy the oil.
But if I am the United States...
You just print the dollars. You can exchange pieces of paper, or today, just digital entries on a screen for real physical goods and services from the rest of the world.
It is a massive structural subsidy to the empire's standard of living.
It really is. You are literally trading IOUs for cars, electronics, and energy.
It's like having a magical credit card that you never really have to pay off because everyone else just wants to hold onto your debt as a safe asset.
In a mechanical way, yes. As long as they trust you, they will hold the debt. And that mechanism allows the empire to live far beyond its actual means.
So let's recap this whole design phase. It's an incredible virtuous cycle,
Better education leads to better tech,
which leads to more trade,
which funds a powerful military,
which secures a global financial center,
which establishes a reserve currency.
and that reserve currency status gives you even more cheap resources to invest right back into education and tech.
It is entirely self-reinforcing. Success breeds resources, which breeds more success. That is the architecture of the rise.
And when you are living inside that phase, it feels completely unstoppable.
It does. It is why the people living inside it always think they have somehow solved the puzzle of history. They think the good times are a permanent state of being.
But when we do systems analysis, this machine doesn't just keep spinning up forever, it eventually hits a ceiling.
It peaks.
And this brings us to the second major part of our deep dive, the incentives, the architecture of the top.
This is where the psychology of the population shifts. And it's deeply fascinating because it happens slowly over generations.
Dalio talks extensively about the shift from the generation that actually built the wealth to the generation that just inherits it.
The hardened by struggle generation versus the accustomed to comfort generation.
Right, this is the classic trope, right? Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men. But here, it's actually backed up by hard macroeconomic data.
Exactly. The first generation fights for the peace. They build the industry from the ground up. They are incredibly frugal, highly productive, and extremely resilient.
They have that immigrant mindset even if they were born there.
Right. They save a huge percentage of their income because they remember what it was like to have nothing.
So they fiercely protect what they build.
But their massive success fundamentally alters the environment for their children and their grandchildren.
Who grow up rich.
They grow up rich. They are entirely used to luxury. They're less tough just purely by environmental conditioning. They take the underlying stability completely for granted.
And crucially, from an economic standpoint, their labor becomes very expensive.
This is what the cycle refers to as the lazy phase.
That lazy is a pretty loaded word.
It is, and the source material is very careful not to moralize this too much. It's not a moral failing. Economically speaking, as a nation becomes vastly richer, if workers naturally demand higher wages.
They want shorter hours.
They want weekends off. They demand heavy safety regulations.
And honestly, that is great for quality of life. I like having my weekends off, and I highly prefer not losing a finger in a machine.
We all do. That is the entire goal of building a civilization.
But structurally, systematically, it completely kills your global competitiveness.
Suddenly, there are rising nations out there. Hungry nations who are willing to work much harder for much less money.
Because they don't have the safety regulations yet. They don't have the weekends off.
So the manufacturing inevitably moves to where the labor is cheapest. The incumbent empire starts losing its absolute edge in production.
You see the shipyards in London close down. You see the steel mills in Pittsburgh board up their windows.
And where do all those jobs go? To the rising power.
And this dynamic leads directly into what the source calls the financialization trap.
Yes, the massive shift from making stuff to making money.
It is a totally standard progression in the cycle. As the empire loses its manufacturing edge, it just leans harder and harder on its status as the world's financial center.
It starts exporting financial services instead of physical goods. The entire domestic economy becomes deeply financialized.
So instead of engineering better steel or better textiles, the best minds are trading stocks and bonds and complex derivatives.
We become the bankers of the world instead of the builders of the world.
And for a while, that feels absolutely great. It feels like natural modernization. You think, why should we get our hands dirty in factories when we can just move capital around on screens and make 10 times the profit?
But this changes the internal incentives of the country deeply. It creates a massive debt incentive.
Let's unpack that. Because intuitively, you would think if a country is at the peak of its wealth, it wouldn't need to borrow any money.
That is the core paradox of the top. When you are at the absolute peak, prosperous and comfortable, people and governments start betting heavily that the future will look exactly like the recent past.
They assume the economic party will just go on forever.
So they borrow. And they don't borrow to build new factories or infrastructure. They borrow to consume.
They leverage up to buy nicer houses, better cars, luxury goods, all assuming their income will continuously rise to easily cover the new debt.
They leverage up, and because they hold the reserve currency, the rest of the world is more than happy to keep lending to them.
That right there is the trap. The reserve currency status actually acts like a massive painkiller for the economy. It completely masks the underlying illness.
It delays the natural feedback loop.
The empire can run massive deficits, spending way more than it actually earns for decades longer than any normal country ever could.
If a normal emerging market country, say Argentina or Turkey, tried to borrow that much relative to their production, their currency would crash immediately.
Interest rates would spike to 20% and force them to stop. The global market would basically slap them in the face and say no more.
But the empire.
Hmm.
The empire gets a free pass.
So the rot just deepens underneath the surface.
Yeah.
The structural debt becomes astronomical before anyone really feels any acute pain.
And while all this debt is rapidly building up, something else is quietly happening to the social fabric of the country.
The wealth gap.
Yes. And the force points out this is just a natural mechanical function of capitalism.
Right. Dalio views capitalism as a machine for allocating resources efficiently, but he notes that it naturally and relentlessly concentrates wealth over time.
It's a feature of the system, not a bug.
In a pure mechanical sense, yes. Because the people who already own assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, they benefit disproportionately when the economy financializes and debt expands.
Because all that newly borrowed money eventually flows right into asset prices.
If the government prints money or if the central bank drops interest rates to zero, the stock market goes up. Housing prices skyrocket.
And if you own a bunch of stocks and houses, you suddenly get vastly richer on paper. You feel like an absolute genius.
But what if you don't own assets? What if you just rely on an hourly wage?
Then your wages stagnate.
Yeah.
Especially because your labor competitiveness is dropping due to that global competition we talked about earlier.
So the rich get exponentially richer while the poor get squeezed by inflation and stagnant pay. The middle class just starts to hollow out completely.
But Dalio notes that this wealth gap doesn't cause a revolution immediately.
No. As long as the overall economic pie is still growing, people tend to tolerate the inequality.
Right. They might be getting a much smaller slice, proportionally speaking. But if their specific slice is still getting slightly bigger in absolute terms,
like if they can still afford to buy a bigger flat-screen TV or lease a slightly nicer car on credit,
they stay quiet. The social tension remains latent.
It is the grand illusion of prosperity fueled entirely by cheap debt.
Until the music finally stops.
Until the music stops. And that brings us to the third major phase of the cycle. Outcomes. The actual mechanics of decline.
This is where the rubber meets the road. The arrival of the bust.
The trigger is almost always identical across history. Debt levels eventually grow so large that they overwhelm income levels.
You have borrowed so much money that you can't even pay the interest on the debt without borrowing even more money.
It literally becomes a systemic Ponzi scheme. And at the exact same time, the central bank runs out of its primary ammunition.
The bottle of stimulant runs completely dry.
Interest rates hit zero. You can't lower them any further to stimulate borrowing because they are already at the floor. And that is when the bubble bursts.
So now the government is staring down the barrel of a massive crisis. The economy is crashing, major institutions are defaulting on debt, and the public is furious. What do they do?
Dalio outlines a decision tree here that seems incredibly rigid. It's almost mathematical.
They basically have two choices. Choice one is austerity.
You cut government spending drastically, you raise taxes, you pay down the debts, and you just accept the massive economic pain.
Which sounds highly responsible. It is exactly what a normal household has to do. If I max out all my credit cards, I have to stop eating out at restaurants and pay them off.
It is financially responsible, but politically it is absolutely impossible.
Totally impossible.
In a democracy, or honestly even in an autocracy, telling the population you are all going to be much poorer for the next decade so we can fix the national balance sheet gets you fired immediately.
Or overthrown violently. No politician in history gets elected on a platform of eat your vegetables and suffer.
Exactly. So they inevitably go to choice two.
They print money.
They always print.
They always print. The source material is completely emphatic about this point. Throughout all of history, when faced with a massive deflationary depression, governments always choose to print fiat money to fill the hole in the balance sheet.
It is inflationary, sure, but it relieves the immediate political pain. It keeps the government checks flowing to the people.
But this decision has a devastating structural outcome.
Currency debasement.
If you print trillions of new dollars or guilders or pounds out of thin air, you are mathematically devaluing the currency.
You are effectively wiping out the national debt by just making the money itself worth less.
It is a self-default. You promised to pay your creditors back $100, and you do. But those $100 now only buy half as much real stuff as they used to.
It's brilliant in a dark way, but here is the massive kicker. You aren't just wiping out the debt, you are simultaneously wiping out the life savings of the middle class.
The grandmothers and the pension funds get crushed.
You are forcefully transferring wealth from responsible savers to reckless debtors.
If I saved responsibly my entire life, I get deeply punished by the inflation. If I borrowed recklessly to buy speculative assets, I essentially get bailed out.
And this blatant unfairness violently accelerates the social polarization.
This is exactly where we enter what Dalio calls stage 5.
Stage 5 of the internal cycle. This is where populism just explodes onto the scene.
And what's really interesting is how the source treats populism. It doesn't treat it as a fleeting mood or just an obnoxious political style. It treats it as a hard metric, a purely systemic data point.
Right. It's not about whether you personally like the populist leader or find them offensive. It is about the structural reasons why they suddenly exist and have so much power.
It is a systemic signal. Dalio calls it the toxic mix.
You have high systemic debt, plus a massive structural wealth gap, plus a sudden economic shock.
When those three specific things align, you get populism. Every single time in history.
And the psychological construct of fairness completely collapses.
That is the key psychological break in the empire.
The rich look at the poor, and they just see them as a massive drag on the economy. They think, why should I pay higher taxes to support these people? They are just lazy.
And the poor look at the rich and see them entirely as thieves. They think you rigged the political system to hoard all the wealth. You didn't actually earn it.
So the political center just completely evaporates.
You get a radical populist movement on the left and a radical populist movement on the right.
They become increasingly extreme. They absolutely refuse to compromise on anything. They stop seeing the opposition as political rivals and start seeing them as literal enemies of the state.
Political fragmentation at its finest.
And here is the crucial analytic insight for the cycle. This extreme polarization drastically reduces the nation's capacity for coordinated reform at the exact moment the system needs it the most.
Just when you desperately need to make hard bipartisan decisions to fix the debt crisis, you are completely paralyzed by internal tribal fighting.
It's like a massive ship sailing directly into a Category 5 hurricane. But instead of working together to batten down the hatches, the crew just starts a vicious knife fight on the deck over who gets to be captain.
Which leads to internal disorder. There's a complete disregard for traditional rules and norms.
Fighting and destroying the other side becomes way more important than actually solving the nation's problems. We move from a culture of win-win solutions to a culture of lose-lose fighting.
And the statistical risk of severe civil conflict rises exponentially.
It really does. When the gap between the haves and the have-nots becomes totally unbridgeable and the economy is stagnating, history shows that some form of internal revolution or civil war is highly probable. The system just snaps under the pressure.
This is an incredibly grim picture we're painting here. We have gone from this beautiful golden age of education and trade to a paralyzed, heavily indebted, internally fighting nation.
It's dark.
So the obvious question I have, and I'm sure you listening have too, is why do we keep doing this? Why does this specific system repeat so flawlessly across centuries? Why do we ever learn?
This brings us to the section on persistence, why the system repeats. And there are three main systemic drivers here.
First is the human element.
Human nature itself. Fear, greed, tribalism. These are absolute constant variables in the equation.
Our technology changes constantly, our clothes change, our languages evolve. But human software, it hasn't had a major structural upgrade in 50,000 years.
We are ultimately still the exact same basic primates walking on the savannah. We just happen to have nuclear weapons and complex hedge funds now.
Exactly. Because core human nature doesn't change. The massive macro cycles driven by that human nature don't change either.
Yeah.
We react to economic incentives the exact same way our ancestors did.
Then there's a second driver, the duration mismatch. I have to say this one really struck me as the most deceptive part of the whole trap.
It is a massive perceptual gap.
The long-term debt cycle lasts roughly 50 to 100 years, but a human life is only roughly 80 years.
So the vast majority of people never actually live to see a full cycle play out from start to finish.
Exactly. What you personally experience is the short-term business cycle. You see mild recessions every 8 or 10 years. You get totally used to those.
You know, stock market goes down for a bit and then the central bank steps in, it comes right back up.
So you logically extrapolate that limited experience out into infinity.
You assume the long-term trend is perfectly stable simply because you haven't seen the major turn happen in your own lifetime. Your grandparents maybe saw the tail end of the last major depression, but you certainly didn't.
It's exactly like the turkey before Thanksgiving.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. Every single day, the farmer comes out and feeds the turkey. So the turkey's statistical model of reality says the farmer loves it. The data is solid. The turkey's confidence level in the farmer is at its absolute highest the exact day before it gets its head chopped off.
That is exactly how market psychology works at the peak. We extrapolate the immediate past into the future. We don't see the 75-year cliff rapidly approaching because we haven't lived through it.
We constantly tell ourselves this time is different or the markets always recover eventually.
And that blindness leads us to the third driver of persistence: institutional inertia.
This brings us right back to the politics of it all. Extreme electoral and financial pressures force institutional leaders to constantly choose short-term relief over long-term health.
The printing money option we discussed earlier.
Right. It is politically fatal to be the one leader who finally hits the reset button, to stand up and say, we need to suffer a massive depression for 10 years to fix this structural rot.
So the broken system just persists. Leaders repeatedly kick the can down the road. They add more debt, they print more money, they add more market distortions.
Until the system simply breaks under its own mathematical weight. The incentives are perfectly aligned to keep the machine running right up until the gears completely strip. No one wants to be the one holding the bag when it turns off.
So we have the mechanics of internal decline firmly locked in. But Dalio points out that empires rarely ever fall solely from internal rot. There is almost always a massive push from the outside.
Interconnection, the external threat.
This is where we apply the historical framework directly to the current geopolitical situation.
Yeah.
The source material is very explicit here about the dynamic between the United States and China.
And again, I want to remind everyone, this isn't about taking political sides. It is purely about looking objectively at the systemic metrics.
It rigorously applies the exact rise mechanics we discussed to the current challenger, China.
So let's run down the historical checklist we established at the very beginning of the deep dive. Education.
Rising rapidly. They've built a high meritocracy in their educational system. They are currently producing STEM graduates at a sheer scale that completely dwarfs the West.
Productivity.
Massive. Over the last few decades, they have aggressively become the world's primary factory. They literally took that exact role from the incumbent empire. Dominant. They are currently the largest single trading partner for the vast majority of countries on Earth.
And now we see their military strength growing rapidly, specifically to protect that massive web of trade. China is following the exact archetypal path that the Dutch, the British, and the Americans followed before them.
They're building the Blue Water Navy to protect the merchant fleet. It is the exact same historical script, line for line.
And this structural reality creates what the source calls the destiny of conflict.
The rising power inevitably challenges the existing power. They challenge them in global trade, in cutting-edge technology, in capital markets, and ultimately in geopolitics.
It's functionally unavoidable. The rising power naturally wants a seat at the global table that accurately reflects its new economic strength.
And the existing power obviously doesn't want to give that seat up. They view the economic challenge as an aggressive threat.
And the incumbent, in this case the U.S., is stuck in a massive trap.
The U.S. is deep in the late cycle phase. Record high debt, extreme internal division, rampant populism. And it is facing what Dalio calls the defense dilemma.
Which is what exactly?
The empire must defend its global order. The U.S. currently has military bases in over 70 countries. It functionally guarantees the security of global shipping lanes and defends allies everywhere.
But maintaining that global posture is astronomically expensive?
It is incredibly uneconomical. The raw cost of maintaining the physical empire now vastly exceeds the actual economic revenue the empire generates.
So you have a brutal binary choice. Do you fight to maintain it all? If you fight an external war and actually lose, that is obviously the worst possible outcome. It bankrupts you instantly.
Or do you retreat?
If you retreat and pull back your forces, you openly signal weakness to the world. You signal to the global markets that you can no longer actually guarantee the world order.
And that immediately accelerates the loss of your reserve currency status. If you can't protect the trade routes, why should other nations continue to hold and trade in your currency?
It is a complete lose-lose scenario. If you stay engaged everywhere, you bleed out financially. If you leave, you collapse in confidence.
It is an incredibly precarious position. And remember, these systems are deeply nested together. This isn't just two separate boxers standing in a ring. They are functionally conjoined twins.
The capital flows. This is the critical nested system.
Exactly. The challenger, China, actually holds a massive amount of the incumbent's debt. For decades, China aggressively saved money and bought U.S. Treasury bonds. They literally funded American domestic consumption.
We bought their incredibly cheap manufactured goods. They took our dollars and lent them right back to us so we could afford to buy even more goods.
A massive macroeconomic feedback loop of pure codependency. But now that exact system is fracturing under the geopolitical stress. We are actively seeing decoupling.
We are moving rapidly from a system based on efficiency to a system based on security.
Right. Globalization was entirely about maximum efficiency. Make the product wherever labor and materials were the absolute cheapest. Decoupling is entirely about national security.
Make the product here at home, even if it costs twice as much, because we might realistically go to war with our previous supplier.
Which structurally means much higher baseline inflation.
And much higher economic inefficiency across the board.
Dalio uses a metric he calls the total power index to visualize all of this clearly.
It is a composite chart where you literally see the historical lines crossing. The U.S. total power line is currently flattening out or declining slightly. The China power line is rising very steeply.
And the absolute danger zone mathematically is the actual crossover point.
When the two rival powers are roughly equal, the statistical risk of a hot war is at its absolute highest.
Because the outcome of a conflict is highly uncertain. If one side is clearly overwhelmingly stronger, you don't fight, you negotiate.
But when both sides look at the data and think they might actually be able to win the internal temptation to test, that power becomes overwhelming.
Okay, let's pull back for a second. We have extensively mapped this entire machine. We've seen the design of the rise, the perverse incentives of the top, the mechanical outcomes of the decline, the persistence of basic human nature, and the interconnection of the rising rival.
Now we need to directly address the title of this project, the crisis in perception. This is where we bring the synthesis together. We need to land the plane.
How do we strictly apply this term crisis in perception to everything we've just discussed?
We use it analytically to describe the massive lag between reality and recognition. The core crisis is that the global market and the general populace still perceive the reserve currency as entirely safe, even as the underlying fundamentals scream extreme danger.
It is the classic frog in boiling water scenario.
Exactly. We completely normalize the late-stage disorder. We see unprecedented political polarization. We see trillions of dollars in casual money printing, and we just shrug our shoulders.
We think, oh, well, this is just how it is now.
We stubbornly assume the system will always hold simply because it always has in our limited experience. We are perceiving the complex world as it was 20 years ago, not as it actually structurally is today.
So let me ask the crucial question that ties this all together. What is the crisis in perception here?
The crisis is a layered, systemic misperception of reality. It's not just missing one single data point. It is a complete failure to see the global system at three distinct structural layers.
What is layer one?
Misperception one is thinking that individual political personalities are the actual cause of the social chaos. People obsess constantly over the specific leader of the moment. They honestly think if they just get rid of politician X or elect politician Y, the chaos will just magically stop. They treat global politics like a simple superhero movie.
But the systems level analysis says what?
The structural correction is that these leaders are purely symptoms of stage 5. The deep structural forces, the astronomical debt, and the massive wealth gap produce the populism. The populists do not create the wave, they merely ride it.
If you surgically remove the specific person but leave the massive debt and the crushing wealth gap, the machine will just naturally produce another populist to replace them.
Exactly. You are essentially firing the local weatherman because you hate that it's raining.
Misperception 2.
Believing the status quo is a permanent state of nature, the crisis is stubbornly assuming it can't happen here.
We deeply think America, or the broader West, is somehow completely exceptional, that the established laws of macro history simply do not apply to us because of our modern technology.
The structural correction is that history clearly shows that reserve currencies and global empires always fail eventually. Every single one. There are zero historical exceptions to this rule. The Dutch guilder is completely gone as a world power. The British pound is a secondary regional currency. The crisis is the profound arrogance of the present moment.
And misperception 3.
Focusing heavily on the noise rather than the signal. We focus all our attention on the manic daily news cycle. The angry tweets, the trivial political scandals, the minor market blips. We are completely addicted to the notification screen.
while entirely ignoring the massive 75-year arc.
The structural correction is that systems-level analysis reveals the macro trajectory is highly mathematical. It is driven rigidly by debt service costs, national productivity rates, and baseline demographics.
These forces are like massive glaciers.
Yes, they move incredibly slowly, but they absolutely crush everything in their path. The crisis in perception is staring intensely at the tiny waves on the surface of the ocean while completely ignoring the massive tectonic shift happening underneath.
That is what's extremely sobering.
It is meant to be sobering, because structural clarity is the only real antidote. If you don't actually see the massive wave coming, you drown. If you see it, you can grab a surfboard or at least smartly get yourself to higher ground.
So to cleanly summarize where we stand today, according strictly to the source material, we are incredibly late in the long-term debt cycle. We are deep in the throes of stage 5 internal disorder, and we are actively facing a rapidly rising external rival.
That is the objective position on the board. The dashboard lights are all flashing bright red.
And the choice moving forward.
Systems can naturally bend or they can catastrophically break, but they simply cannot be ignored. Deeply understanding these historical mechanics is the only real way to navigate the coming turbulence. You absolutely cannot stop the winter from coming, but you can certainly buy a thick coat. You can prepare your portfolio and your family.
And perhaps if enough people actively understand the mechanics of the machine, we can manage the inevitable decline or the global transition more gracefully than empires have in the past. We don't necessarily have to repeat the absolute bloodiest punks of history if we collectively recognize the pattern.
One can certainly hope, but passive hope is not a strategy. Understanding the cycle is.
We will leave you with a final thought to really chew on. If we are genuinely in stage 5 of the cycle, and the endless printing of fiat money is the absolutely inevitable drug of choice for a failing system, what is the actual value of the paper money sitting in your pocket right now? Is it truly a reliable store of long-term value? Or is it simply a share of stock in a slowly declining empire?
A highly provocative question to end on. Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.